Welcome back to another episode of That's Business. Today's guest, Kendra, is a restorative practices facilitator and civil rights investigator and the founder of Restore Resolutions, LLC. Restore helps schools, families, those in the criminal justice system, and in workplaces access restorative resolutions to harm. Several years ago, Kendra got hooked on restorative justice when she discovered that a restorative approach aligned more with her values and beliefs about extending empathy and dignity to all involved in complex resolution processes. Kendra, I'm so excited because we have so many good things to talk about today. First of all, did we always want to be in the civil rights movement and this restorative justice? I mean, it makes sense, but what did you want to be when you grew up, or what was your childhood like? Throwing it back.
Woo! Light question to start.
Yeah.
No, I did not always want to be in the civil rights movement. So originally, I wanted to be a doctor. Ooh. And I realized after my second organic chemistry class, when the professor, first day of class, professor said, if you got a C or below in the class before this one, you might want to rethink taking this class. And I thought, yeah, I do want to rethink taking this class. I got up and walked out.
That's awesome. Bye.
Bye. Yeah, that was a real turning point moment because I just had been reflecting on how miserable my last year had been and thinking, I don't want to extend this out ad infinitum the rest of my life. And so I just started to settle into thinking about what lit me up. And as I thought about it, it was my, psychology classes. It was my women's studies classes. It was my identity, race-based identity classes. And I was like, I'm just going to turn up the volume a little bit on these things. Graduated with a psych and natural science degree in women's studies. Was working in a law firm at the time. And this lawyer was like, hey, what are you going to do after you graduate? And I was like, I'm going to be a social worker and do public health so I can work on policies. Like, nobody listens to social workers. And I was like, oh, okay. Let me rethink that. He's like, go to law school. And I was like, okay.
Sure. Super easy. I mean, you were already going for your doctorate. What's law school? Nothing.
So I did. And thought I would do health law, and then started to get into nonprofit work, started working with women in prison, and really found a resonance with these folks not having a voice. And so wrote a paper about cruel and unusual punishment for especially women who are incarcerated that got published, and decided that I also needed to litigate. Because it was a skill. I was like, I'm a lawyer. I've watched enough TV. I'm like, I really need to be able to say at some point I strenuously object, like somewhere, sometime.
Right.
And so really just did another shift and did the first job where I could litigate, which was being an assistant prosecuting attorney. So kind of did that and realized I hated myself. And who I was becoming. And then eventually started doing student conduct work at a small private college because after I realized that I hated my life again, I reached out to my references and this guy was like, hey, there's this job opening as the director of student conduct. And I was like, okay, I'll try it. And ended up really loving it. And the thing I loved about it was this shift in perspective where we looked at like people who were engaging in conduct. It was more about like, well, what kind of developmental support do they need as opposed to you're bad? And that really lit me up. Hung out in that compliance world for a while, deputy Title IX coordinator, senior civil rights investigator, came to another kind of point again where I was like, man, I am not really helping people. And that's really what I wanted ultimately at the end of the day. And so met some folks at my last institution I was at who were doing restorative justice. And all of a sudden, it's like a beacon was lit. And I was like, I want to do this. In fact, I remember walking back from one of the talks they had given with one of my very good friends. And I'm like, I'm doing this. And she's like, I know.
What a good friend. I know.
So got certified, did the whole thing, and then started doing these restorative practices in my investigative work. So, for example, like we'd have these educational conversations with people, and I just started asking restorative questions around it. I had people who had been accused of things saying, thank you. Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for letting me tell my story. And so that felt really good. And so I quit as an investigator and started my own company. And through referrals from my friends at, the institution, my business started.
Now, breaking down restorative justice, because this is I immediately, when we met, and Kendra and I only met a few months ago, I was like, oh my God, I wish I had you when I was in college. This is great. There were so many people that needed you. But breaking it down to the simplest definition, what is the premise of restorative justice? How is this different from typical like slap on the wrist or the problematic colleges that we have now, and how that's like, oh, well, I won't get into details, but we bonded over stories. So
Yeah.
How is that different in the work you're doing and how that's really making a difference?
So restorative justice, like when there has been some kind of harm, whether it's, a disagreement or discrimination or crime, it asks the question, who's been harmed, how, and who might have an obligation to start to repair that harm, and who else was impacted. Those are kind of the three focused questions of restorative justice. In contrast, HR kind of corrective action or criminal system or student conduct, those folks are typically asking the question, who did it, what rule did they break, and what punishment should apply? Where punishment equals accountability.
Right.
And in restorative justice, doing sorry and making things right equals accountability. And so it really is about broken relationships instead of broken rules. And that's kind of my 1,000-foot level view. Taking it just slightly deeper, I like to explain it by way of explaining the restorative practices pyramid. Restorative practices are kind of the overarching kind of philosophical lens through which we see restorative justice. And so at the base and the biggest tier 0 of this restorative pyramid is where we work on like relationship to self, right? Because without having this sense of knowing who you are, accepting who you are, liking who you are, without that, in every interaction, you're constantly tending to some element of that instead of having the capacity to really see who's in front of you and hear who's in front of you. And so it's why in the work, we spend about 80 to 90% of the time at that level. And then we work on skills associated with, at the tier 1 level, building positive relationships with others. And then the next step up is tier 2, which is when we run into challenges. It could be like giving feedback to somebody or having a Thanksgiving dinner where you feel uncomfortable, right? How you have those kinds of conversations where you're coming alongside someone instead of standing over someone, entrenched in different points of view. And then the next layer up is tier 3, which is where we talk about serious harm. Again, it's your discrimination, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, race-based discrimination, disability-based discrimination, all those things. There's a lot more structure around it to help ensure safety. And then the final tier is reintegration. How do we come back into community with one another, right, in an intentional and thoughtful way, whether it's from after a period of suspension, incarceration, or some other break, could be even smaller. And so that's it in a nutshell for me. And it's not the work that I do in as much as it is the approach I want to take to life, because this is actually in a book that Oprah was a co-author on. It's really about asking the question, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you?
Simple change. Just one word makes a difference.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've gotten asked this, but how do you kind of separate personal life, professional life? How do you not take all of this home with you? This is heavy stuff. And you were getting me, as someone who doesn't cry too often, I was like, you're getting me emotional when we were talking the first time. And that was one of the reasons I ended up getting out of being a criminal investigator and doing those things because I could not. I still to this day, I mean, even with a client or anyone's story, I'm like, I want to help you. I'll lose sleep over it. But how do you separate the two? Because you're dealing with such heavy topics here.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't.
That's
right?
fair.
Like I just don't.
Yeah.
And so in those times, I have to ask for support from the people around me, whether it's space, whether it's understanding, compassion. And this is why I think that tier 0, the self-work, is so important, because I have learned when I am outside of that kind of grounded place. And I think that's a spectrum, right? Like, and so when I brought something home, I'm in the out of balance spectrum. And typically when I'm bringing something home, there are usually other things happening where I'm just depleted, right? And so it's more, I see it more as a sign, like I need additional support. And it could vary just depending on the circumstance. So sometimes I journal a lot every day. And so 2 kind of foundational practices that I have are an appreciation journal, because I just can't get on board with gratitude yet, and a self-compassion practice, journaling, right? And so sometimes when I'm in that space, I have a bigger runway, hours instead of like an hour of that.
You're not on board with gratitude. I am so thrilled you said that, because I've had a gratitude journal that was gifted to me. And I'm like, I love my future mother-in-law, but I was like, I don't know how to write this. Like, this is the one I am struggling with. So I'd love your perspective. Why do you feel that way? Because I feel like you're just going to answer it for me.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is really rooted in, I think, a growing up time of obligation, lots of obligation. Church on Sunday, every Sunday, do and act good so that you are good. Say thank you all the time. And it's this kind of coercive happying up that I just really resist. And so I can't be in alignment with my authenticity to just say, I am grateful for all these things. Because I think what's more true for me anyway, is I can appreciate elements of these experiences, but I don't love them.
Right.
Like, I appreciate the quiet of the morning, but I'm not grateful I have to wake up this early, right? Like it's just,
Yes.
It just feels like I can move closer to that, but I'm not all in on gratitude, because I don't always feel the fullness of gratitude that I expect, I guess, or is expected of me.
Right. And I feel like it's on the route of a little toxic positivity of it's, you need to be thankful for everything. Or I love my family, but I come from a family of like, you didn't say thank you.
Exactly.
Like, why didn't you say thank you? And I'm like, I didn't. And my response is like, I didn't ask to be born. You put me in all these bills and all these things.
Listen.
Like, I need to say thank you for everything. And I am very respectful, let's be clear. But growing up, especially, my dad is still to this day, like, say thank you, shake his hand. And I'm like, not the fucking Pope. Like, what are you doing? Like, what? You're not the president. Like, what are you talking about?
Yes.
It's just very weird.
I agree with that. And I think so many times, especially folks who are traditionally marginalized, are put in those positions. So, for example, someone gets my daughter a pink dress. Does she need to say thank you for the dress that she hates? No. But she can express gratitude for the thought that someone wanted to give her something, right? So being able to distinguish that and still tend to a connection without being dishonest about and inauthentic, right? I think that's I guess what I am aiming for with the gratitude, right? Because you're right. Like, thank you for making assumptions about my gender, right? Like, that doesn't sound cool, but like, that's how you might be feeling.
Right. No, it definitely is. And I'm very thankful you brought this topic up, because it is true. And I've learned too, like, we were before we started recording talking about business owner issues and how you said it best. If one of the pillars goes wrong, it's just like so detrimental and it takes up so much headspace. And I am thankful. I'm grateful to have my own business, but this fall has kicked my ass. And this is where, if you would ask me, I would say, I don't know. I'm very 50-50. These are the issues you got to solve as a business owner. So I think it's up and down. And I love positivity, but I'm also more of a let's be positive in the realm of things. And what is, everyone has so many different issues or different problems, and life is hard anyways. And why do we need to throw the toxic positivity and the gaslighting on top of oh, you're fine, think positive, or oh, you should be grateful for what you have?
No, and I think we could do a real disservice to understanding our inner world when that happens. And I just feel so strongly about being able to identify feelings and needs, met needs and unmet needs, right? And that we would honor our feelings as those kind of energetic messengers of what we need or don't need. And I think for a long time, so many of us, including myself, got the message that to be valuable, you have to do something that's worthwhile to other people. And I really just reject that. It put me in so many places where I ignored who I was. I associated with people who were harmful, because I was just trying to get through. I was just trying to be the best at whatever it was and have my performance equate to value and worth.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting too, and I don't know if you feel this way as well, but when you start the entrepreneur journey in doing something as serious and as needed as you are, I do think you find out who really is good for you and who's not in relationships, or finding out, someone you met at a table at the Women's Business Network conference that you bond with, as we did. But I think it's a really interesting journey, and especially you going through this personally and just being able to better serve the people you work with. I mean, I know I keep saying it's so great what you do, but it really is. It is, wow, you are just incredible. So just trailblazing for what we need to talk about and what the tough conversations. I mean, it's hard, and our whole system is many, many, many issues, as we know. Sorry for the tangent. So what does this look like when people work with you? Do you work with universities? Do you work with, tell us a little bit more about that without giving away everything that you do.
Yeah. So I work with a lot of schools at the moment, though I have worked with churches. I've worked with folks in the criminal system. I've worked with families also. But traditionally, I will get contacted by, somebody who's in a compliance role, who wants, or the people that they're serving want to get a conflict resolved that's not an investigation, right? They don't want a formal investigation. They just want some more ease in the relationship, or they just, so for example, if it's a sexual assault, I get a lot of sexual assault cases actually. So I'll just use that one as an example. A lot of colleges and universities under federal guidance are required to offer some kind of what they call informal resolution. And what many have come to agree is that restorative justice actually does the heavy lifting when it comes to actually resolving cases. And so through kind of common networks, the Title IX coordinator will contact me. They'll break down kind of an overview of the case. And I'll say, yes, I have the capacity to handle that, or no, I'm not your person, right? Kind of do just an internal gut check. Then I get connected with the participants, and I have kind of an initial meeting with them. And I ask them 3 questions always. What happened, from your point of view, without assuming anything? Who else was impacted? And what do you think is needed to make things right, in your opinion? Because it leaves room for the person who it's assumed that it caused the harm to have experienced the harm, maybe in the system, right? And it gives them that space to say, yeah, I was hurting, so I hurt somebody else. And so, okay, great, let's get you maybe some skills, support, et cetera, around that kind of source issue. Then the next step is just to teach them a little bit about the language of feelings and needs. And I do that through the connection practice, which is a tool to kind of dig deeper into that, and a practice to help use their own insights to get to that. And so from that, people get really clear about what they need as a desired outcome. And then we decide on the pathway. So we could go with a restorative circle, which really focuses on a group of folks. And sometimes the person or group that's maybe caused them harm is in the center of the circle to hear and absorb, or can contribute to it after people who've been harmed get a chance to speak. Or we could do something called restorative conference, which is smaller and just includes people who are directly impacted. And at the end of each of those processes, what we're looking for is for each of the impacted parties, but primarily the person who was harmed, to say what they need to start to heal, to start to do the repair work. And so, for example, with a sexual assault case, though this sounds like it wouldn't matter, a lot of times they want an apology. But before that, they want just acknowledgement. Like, why me? Why did you choose me? Why did you do what you did? What has happened since this has happened? Have you thought about it? Or am I the only one living with this, right? That's changed my life dramatically. And they want that acknowledgement, which makes absolute sense. And then they want to know, are you sorry? Did it matter to you? Do I matter as a person, right? And then what do we do to really do or say sorry? And so sometimes if alcohol was involved, for example, they want to know that they're addressing that issue. How are they handling it in the future? So sometimes that's getting help, external help with the alcohol issue. Sometimes it's an anger issue, like intimate partner violence. Are you getting to the core of that? So a lot of times there we're doing inner child work with the person who's caused the harm. And the apology really is, after all of that work, addresses some like key points that a person wants addressed. Especially in a college setting, friends are involved, right? Like common friends or mutual friends. So if somebody misrepresents what happened, the harm party really wants the other person to say, correct that, right? Tell all our friends that you lied about it, right? So that I can reconnect with folks in a legitimate way, right? And so that's just a small, like, kind of snippet. But, you know, Angela, like you and I went deep right away. That's what happens here. Like, if we're talking about transformation, we're talking about some really core issues, some old hurts, some new ones. And that requires of me a lot of vulnerability, right? To sometimes show people what it looks like and not to burden them with, you know, my journey, but more to say, hey, you are not alone in this walk. And so, you know, I get to hear things like 2 weeks before this happened, my dad died unexpectedly. Or, you know, I was hit when I was a kid, right? And told to toughen up. So because it's a space where I'm not making any judgments, I'm just creating a container for them to share it. It allows for a lot of exploration. And then I think paired with kind of a way out of that container when it's needed, like here are some tools to start unpacking this big thing that you've been living around. Some real huge transformations can take place, not just for the conduct that's been named, but for every other relationship they have.
What has been some of the outcomes, or as you keep saying, these transformations, what has resulted from the work you've done?
So I'm trying to figure out how to share some of these things. This is something I'm learning how to do, right? Like,
right.
Is to share this. I think one that comes to mind recently was these two folks who did not speak to each other after this happened at all. Friends separated, whole nine. Actually chose to be brought together in the same space to talk it through after a lot of preparatory, meetings. I had taught them both the connection practice, and I just am looking on screen, I'm seeing both of them, and I'm like, hey, do we need to do just a little quick coherence to arrive in the moment? And they were both like, yeah, we do. We definitely do. And so, got a chance to do that and then started the conference. And just, oh my gosh, Angela, just watching their whole body language change after hearing what the other had experienced since the assault. was incredible. And after this conference, they saw each other on campus and were able to like give each other a hug, just acknowledge each other. And it was like there was freedom where before every day was like, am I going to see this person? For both of them, because it was a reminder of a terrible thing that one person did and the other of a terrible pain that they were carrying. And are they best friends? No. But their life is freer. So they can go to class not worrying if they're going to see this person. They can go to a party and feel like they're part of the community and they don't have to hide an aspect of themselves, either the pain or the suffering, right? They're free to move on to thinking about their future. And I think just seeing that with the two of them, not to mention the relationships within their families. So one was from a divorced family. Being able to speak to a parent and say, this is what I need, when before it was just watching their parent implode, right? And identifying places where they can get their needs met versus like this family of origin that wasn't working out for them. And so while that sounds minor on the surface, I guess I'm not good at adequately addressing like.
I don't think that sounds minor at all. That sounds huge. What are you talking about? That's huge.
Yeah. And I mean, these students, they will come back, right? They'll come back to me. Like one was like, hey, I've moved, but I need some support in this new city. Can you help me identify some support? And I just think, oh my gosh, I love that. I love that you know that there's a support network out here for you as you move forward in your life and you know what you need. And to me, that's huge because it's taken me a long time to learn.
It is. And it's terrifying moving because that's like one of the things I'm like, I don't know if I could ever move outside of Michigan. I'll go travel the world, but I love my community and my support systems and everything. And that's a tough decision. So that's awesome. They reached out to you. That speaks wonders. I mean, wow. Now, those that are listening that maybe want to help out, what are some resources? What are some things people can do to help your mission and support what you're doing?
Wow. Gosh, I got to think about this a minute. I think one thing is helpful is that in your spaces, whether it's your family space, whether it's your workplace, well, let me focus on the workplace. Asking your employer, like, do you have informal resolution mechanisms? Because one huge issue in any organization, whether it's a workplace, a school, etc., is people not reporting their concerns, either because they don't want to get someone in trouble or because they don't feel like they'd be supported. And so I think asking your employer, for example, like, do you have informal resolution? Because I really want to know, and what kind of confidential support do you have for people as they move forward in this process? So I think just asking about it, finding out more about it, and then, maybe offering like, hey, I heard about this thing, restorative justice. Do you know anything about it?
It is interesting. And I think a lot of people just don't feel comfortable, and not to say HR works on behalf of the company. I could say that I've worked in HR myself. So it's okay, you think you do the right thing, report it, and then it backfires. Or if it's on a senior leader, and yes, we've come a long way from where we were, but it's still not perfect. And there's still people that get let go or get things cut because they reported someone and they're not believed. So I absolutely see this. So, and it depends on the personality. I mean, I'm not afraid to speak up and scream things from the rooftops, as we talked about, but not everyone feels that way, and not everyone feels comfortable sharing their voice. And I think that's an easy practice to think about. I mean, we actually just added it to our employee handbook. I hired an HR consultant, and I was like, oh, that was one thing I thought of. So I love that you called that out, because I didn't even think about a resolution or things like that, because the time will come. I mean, it absolutely will come. It's just a matter of when. So I think that's an easy start to maybe even think about whether you're looking to get a new opportunity, whether you're looking to land a new client or a partnership. What does that look like? Because that's something really easy that can be referred to in a handbook, in an offer letter on their values, mission statement, whatever on their website. But that's something small, and you never think it's going to happen to you until it does happen to you or someone you know.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, from the employer standpoint, one thing that I might just offer is that at least where data has been gathered in the juvenile criminal system, what they found is that it costs, like the restorative option costs about $30,000 less on average than incarceration, for example. And the participants, both the people who've been accused and those who have suffered the harm, have an 80 to 90% satisfaction rate. And it reduces repeat behavior by about 45%, which, I mean, that's for folks who are in a criminal setting. So, I mean, it is highly effective and it's cost effective. So in terms of whether you want to build out a whole, restorative response, I think it's valuable. And I also, whether you're receiving the service or whether you're implementing it from an employer standpoint, and I would also say that it's from that point that maybe you might want to start looking at restorative practices throughout the culture. Like, how do we handle conflict? How do we handle disagreement? And maybe agreeing to an approach ahead of time.
Because a lot of these companies, I don't think, my little thing I like to say lately is they want you to be a leader until you act like a leader. And then they don't want the conflict. They don't want you to disagree. This is the way we've done it for 50, 60 years. Why change it now? So if we think about that, well, what, in 1970 something, when women were finally allowed to have mortgages and credit cards and their own rights, in a sense, like wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't.
So I think it's revisiting these policies. And I get asked all the time, they're like, well, how do I know if company's good if they're not toxic? I'm like, well, this is a great example. And I will absolutely add this to the advice I give to people because it's true. I mean, we all have different communication styles, especially if you're working globally with other countries, different communication styles there. But how do you handle that? And it should all be respectful, and all voices should be heard, but they're not oftentimes. And that goes back to different communities of people getting marginalized, and especially in the workplace, that happens all the time.
Well, yeah. And I would add, too, one thing that's coming up more often is just neurodivergence, right? And how to navigate that. And so here again, I think when you have a structure, agreed ahead of time structure for how you're going to navigate a meeting, how you're going to bring ideas forward, how you're going to disagree, how you're going to offer feedback. And I would say one fantastic resource in this regard in the workplace, especially, is Brene Brown's Dare to Lead.
Yes.
So she gives a great framework for that, how to come alongside someone, and also how to have some basic principles that you all can agree to, like keeping things in the vault when it's something really serious and difficult, right? That we're not going to be poisoning the environment around us when something hard has happened, and how to still get support and help around it. So she offers a great structure.
And the book's incredible. I've read it myself. You also can get the certification now. So yes, that is a great framework to even start. And it's a fun read. Audio, I think I did the audio book. Great resource to provide. What do we need to be aware of? I mean, for, let's say, advice to people out there. I mean, what do people need to be aware of? What language should they be listening to? When should they understand, like, this is not, or this is where restorative justice could be helpful, or things like that in everyday life and work? I mean, honestly, everywhere in life.
Yeah, this is a great question. And let me know if I answer this, because the way I'm reinterpreting this is, in some ways, when is it appropriate? Because I would have to say it is not appropriate for every circumstance. So when you have somebody who has caused a harm and is willing to say, yeah, I did that, and yes, I caused someone else harm, whether I intended to or not, they have to at least be at that place, right? Also, the process must be voluntary. You can't be coercing any party into it, right? It must be by agreement that they enter into it, and the outcome must also be agreed to without pushing anyone to do so. So, for example, a lot of times you'll have folks who are like, yeah, I'll do the informal process because it doesn't result in a finding of a violation, right? Cool. If that's where they are alone and they can't get farther, then no, this is not the process for you. Or like if somebody wants just mediation, like, hey, let's just have a transaction so that we can get to an agreement. That's not what this is either, right? This is about the change work on the inside. And if you want to do that work to prevent either yourself or someone else from engaging in the same behavior over and over again, and you want to get to a place where there is a transformation, then yes, restorative justice is for you.
So I'm curious, how does that get approached? Like the sexual assault example you gave of they avoided each other on campus and everything like that. How did that interaction come about? Because in my head, as a victim myself, I would never see the person that did this ever be open and would just gaslight and say, that's not at all what happened. So how does that like marriage come together of they're both open? Is it a reach out to both people or is both come at you? I mean, how does that work? Because I'm really curious on that.
Yeah. So typically what happens is, at least at a college campus, but this is probably what happened in the workplace too, is the people get notice that there has been some issue, right? And so if you're reporting to HR or if you're reporting to some kind of student conduct officer on campus, it's really from the institution that both parties would get notice and then they respond, right? Like, and in their response, they're given the options. We can go to an investigation and hearing. We can go wrong the disciplinary or corrective action route, or we can try this other route, right? Where it doesn't result in a finding of responsible or not responsible, but it does require, some effort. And so originally, people think, well, I want to do informal, it'll take shorter. It will take less time. It will be less work. It will be all the things, right? Like, and so they show up in the space in that way. But to just kind of your specific point, if, somebody showed up in that space and was like, I didn't do anything wrong. I try to ask questions around that because sometimes that's a defense mechanism where being wrong means being bad in their minds, right? And so can we get beyond that? Is that like a theme that you were given in life and you're afraid to be wrong, even though some element of you knows you hurt someone badly, right? And if they're like, no, I didn't. I absolutely didn't do anything wrong. Then I just tell them, then this is definitely not where you want to be. And it ends. Because I'm not negotiating. That's not what this is about. This is like, oh, hey, do you feel strongly, like even if it's not what, Angela said you did, fine. We'll set that aside for the moment, right? Like, but do you think you hurt somebody? And if so, do you want to do something about it? And honestly, 9 times out of 10, they can say yes to that.
That's great. Wow. That's powerful. You keep making me stumble over my words because it's just incredible what you're doing and how many people's lives you are impacting because that happens at such a young, whether it was at a younger age or things like that of just like continuing into adulthood or continuing long term and eliminating those bad behaviors or the 45% chance of it not having a second offense. Like that's awesome. That's huge numbers. Wow. Kendra, as we wrap this up, what advice do you have for listeners? Outside of this whole podcast that you've just done amazing on.
Well, I think I would say this in terms of like finding your fit in the work that you do. I think for so much of my life, I was trying to prove myself. And so my work experiences match that. They match that of striving. They match that of like performing to get value. And I was so miserable. So I think my advice to folks is starting the work search process, or even like in your job right now, asking, like, do I know myself? Do I accept myself? Do I like myself? And if I do, then what lights me up? Even if it's like swimming and it has nothing to do with your actual job. and deepening the feeling of what you love about it. Because when you spend time reflecting on what you love and lights you up, or doing the thing that you love and lights you up, you understand then what lights you up about your work, and you start to match with that. And that, I think, has led me to doing what I love. And so that's what I would offer to others, is just figuring out and spending time in what lights you up after you like and love and accept yourself.
Oh, you're amazing. If you're listening to this, you want to follow the great work Kendra's doing, head to the show notes, follow her on all socials, check out her website, and tune in again next week for another episode of That's Business.